The helicopter door slid open with a metallic screech that cut through the roar of rotors. Below, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, its dark waters churning 30 feet down. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen felt his stomach drop as he realized what was about to happen. There were no parachutes, no safety nets, just three young Marines about to discover that sometimes the most important lesson in military training isn't about following orders, it's about trusting your brothers with your life. What happened next would challenge everything these Marines thought they knew about courage, brotherhood, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of military service. This is the story of three ordinary men who found themselves in an extraordinary situation, where a routine training exercise became a life-changing test of faith, friendship, and the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton as Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen adjusted his helmet strap and checked his gear one final time. The familiar weight of his combat vest felt reassuring against his chest, but today something felt different. Today felt like the kind of day that changes everything. Marcus had been a Marine for 8 years. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, earned his stripes through determination and an unwavering commitment to excellence. At 26, he was considered one of the most reliable non-commissioned officers in his unit. His fellow Marines respected him not just for his rank, but for his calm demeanor under pressure and his ability to make split-second decisions that kept everyone safe. Standing beside him on the tarmac were 2 younger Marines who had become like brothers to him over the past year. Private First Class David Rodriguez, barely 19 but with the heart of a lion, shifted nervously from foot to foot. David was the youngest of 6 children from a working-class family in San Antonio. He joined the Marines straight out of high school, driven by a desire to serve his country and prove himself worthy of the uniform he wore with such pride. The third member of their group was Lance Corporal James Wilson, a quiet 21-year-old from rural Montana, who had a gift for keeping everyone's spirits up even in the darkest moments. James came from 5 generations of military service, and his steady presence had a calming effect on newer recruits. He was the kind of Marine who always had your back, no matter what the situation demanded. The 3 men had been selected for what their commanding officer called Advanced Maritime Rescue Training. The briefing had been deliberately vague, which wasn't unusual in the military. They were told to report to the helicopter pad at 0800 hours with standard gear and to prepare for a full day of training exercises. What they weren't told was that today would test every ounce of trust they had in each other and in the Marine Corps itself. As they waited for their instructor to arrive, Marcus noticed the unusual setup around the helicopter pad. There were no parachutes laid out, no safety briefing materials, and no indication of what type of training they were about to undergo. The only thing that seemed certain was the massive CH-46 Sea Knight helicopter sitting on the pad, its twin rotors gleaming in the morning sun. "Any idea what we're getting ourselves into today?" David asked, his voice betraying just a hint of nervousness beneath his usual confident exterior. Marcus shook his head. "Your guess is as good as mine, Rodriguez. But knowing the Corps, it's going to push us beyond what we think we're capable of." James chuckled softly. "When has it ever been anything else? Remember that night training exercise in the desert when they had us navigate with broken compasses?" The memory brought smiles to their faces. That particular exercise had tested their ability to adapt and overcome when everything went wrong. They'd spent 12 hours in the middle of nowhere, using nothing but the stars in their training to find their way back to base. It had been grueling, but it had also brought them closer together as a team. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Hayes, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for creating training scenarios that pushed Marines to their absolute limits. She was known throughout the base as someone who never asked her Marines to do anything she wasn't willing to do herself. Her weathered face and steady gaze spoke of countless hours spent in training and combat situations. "Good morning, Marines," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came with 2 decades of service. "Today you're going to learn about trust. Real trust. The kind that goes beyond following orders or completing a mission. You're going to learn about putting your life in someone else's hands and knowing they won't let you down." She gestured toward the helicopter. "This training exercise is designed to simulate a real-world maritime rescue scenario. You'll be working as a team to execute a water entry from a helicopter at approximately 30 feet above the ocean surface. The scenario is this. You're part of a rescue team responding to a downed aircraft in hostile waters. Time is critical, and conventional insertion methods aren't available." David's eyes widened slightly. "Ma'am, are we jumping from 30 feet without parachutes?" Gunnery Sergeant Hayes nodded. That's exactly what you're doing, Marine. But you're not doing it alone, and you're not doing it without preparation. This exercise has been conducted safely hundreds of times. The key is following proper technique, trusting your training, and trusting each other. She began walking them toward the helicopter, explaining the fundamentals as they moved. The human body can safely enter water from significant heights if proper technique is maintained. Your job is to work as a team to ensure everyone executes correctly. You'll jump in sequence, with each Marine responsible for confirming the safety of the Marine who jumps after him. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but it wasn't fear he was experiencing. It was the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with any challenging training exercise. He'd learned to trust that feeling over the years. It meant he was fully engaged and ready to perform at his best. The technical briefing continued as they approached the aircraft. They learned about proper body position during the fall, the importance of timing their breathing, and techniques for entering the water to minimize impact. They practiced the movements on the ground until muscle memory began to take over. The most critical element, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes emphasized, is communication and timing. You'll be connected by radio, and each Marine must confirm readiness before the next jump occurs. This isn't about individual heroics. This is about functioning as a cohesive unit under extreme pressure. As they climbed aboard the helicopter, Marcus looked at his two companions. David's nervous energy had transformed into focused determination. James maintained his characteristic calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that spoke of complete commitment to the mission ahead. The helicopter's engines roared to life, and they began their ascent over the Pacific. Through the open door, Marcus watched the ground fall away beneath them. The ocean stretched out endlessly, its surface sparkling in the morning sunlight. From this height, the water looked deceptively peaceful. During the flight, they continued their preparations. They checked and double-checked each other's gear, reviewed hand signals, and went over the sequence of events one more time. The bond between them felt stronger than ever. They weren't just three individual Marines anymore. They were a team facing an unprecedented challenge together. "You know," James said over the noise of the rotors, "my grandfather used to tell me stories about Marines in World War II who had to make impossible jumps to save their fellow soldiers. He always said the hardest part wasn't the jump itself. It was trusting that the man next to you would do whatever it took to make sure you both made it home." David nodded. "My oldest brother is Army. He always said Marines were crazy for the stuff they're willing to do. I guess we're about to prove him right." Marcus smiled. "Crazy like a fox, Rodriguez. Everything we've trained for has led to this moment. We've got the skills, we've got the teamwork, and we've got each other. That's all we need." As the helicopter reached the designated altitude and began hovering over the target area, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes gave them their final instructions. "Remember, Marines, this exercise is about more than just completing a mission. It's about discovering what you're truly capable of when you have absolute faith in your brothers beside you. Are you ready to find out what that feels like?" The three Marines looked at each other and nodded in unison. They were as ready as they would ever be. The helicopter door slid open, and the reality of what they were about to do hit them with full force. 30 feet below, the Pacific Ocean waited. There were no parachutes, no safety harnesses, and no backup plans. There was only training, trust, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood that had brought them to this moment. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped to the edge of the door. Behind him, David and James took their positions. In a few moments, they would discover that sometimes the greatest leaps in life require letting go of everything you think you know about safety and security. They were about to learn that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite that fear, when your brothers are counting on you. The wind whipped through the helicopter cabin as they prepared for what would become one of the defining moments of their military careers. None of them knew it yet, but they were about to participate in an exercise that would test not just their physical capabilities, but their capacity for trust, brotherhood, and selfless service to others. The ocean below seemed to call to them, challenging them to take that first step into the unknown. And as Marines, they were ready to answer that call. The wind from the helicopter rotors created a deafening roar that seemed to penetrate every fiber of Marcus's being as he stood at the edge of the open door. 30 feet below, the Pacific Ocean stretched out like an endless blue canvas, its surface rippling with small waves that caught the sunlight and threw it back in thousands of tiny sparkles. What had seemed like a reasonable distance during ground training now felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Marcus's training kicked in as he ran through his mental checklist one final time. Feet together, arms crossed over chest, chin tucked, eyes focused on the horizon. The technique was designed to minimize impact and reduce the risk of injury. but knowing the theory and executing it under pressure were two entirely different things. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, but it wasn't fear that drove his pulse higher. It was pure adrenaline mixed with the anticipation of pushing beyond what he thought possible. "First jumper, sound off," came Gunnery Sergeant Hayes' voice through his headset, crisp and professional despite the noise around them. "Staff Sergeant Chen, ready for insertion," Marcus responded, his voice steady and clear. Behind him, he could sense David and James preparing themselves, their breathing controlled and focused. The months of training together had created an almost telepathic connection between them. He could feel their confidence in him just as he had complete faith in their abilities. "Weather conditions are optimal, wind speed 5 knots from the southwest, water temperature 72 degrees. Hayes continued. "You have a clear insertion zone with no surface hazards. Execute on your mark, Marine." Marcus took one last look at his teammates. David's young face showed a mixture of determination and excitement, while James maintained his characteristic calm focus. These weren't just fellow Marines anymore, they were his brothers, and in a few moments, their safety would depend on his ability to execute this jump perfectly and guide them through their own insertions. "See you in the water," Marcus said, his words carrying both confidence and affection for the men who had become his closest friends. Without hesitation, he stepped out into the empty air. The first sensation was weightlessness, a moment of pure suspension where gravity seemed to pause before asserting its authority. For what felt like an eternity but lasted only a fraction of a second, Marcus hung in space between the helicopter and the ocean, suspended in a bubble of silence, despite the roar of machinery above him. Then gravity took hold, and he began to fall. The training had prepared him for the physical aspects of the fall, but nothing could have prepared him for the mental experience of plummeting toward the ocean with nothing but technique and trust to keep him safe. Do, do, do. The wind rushed past his face, and the ocean grew larger with each passing second. He forced himself to maintain proper position, keeping his body straight and his arms crossed, fighting the natural urge to flail or attempt to break his fall. The water rushed up to meet him faster than expected. In the final second before impact, Marcus drew a deep breath and tucked his chin to his chest. The impact came like a thunderclap, a shock that traveled through his entire body as he penetrated the surface of the Pacific. The world went silent and blue as he plunged beneath the waves. For a moment, he was completely disoriented. The force of his entry had driven him deeper than anticipated, and the bubbles and turbulence created by his impact made it impossible to see which way was up. Training took over as he stopped fighting the water and allowed his natural buoyancy to guide him toward the surface. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds, his head broke through into sunlight and blessed air. "First jumper in the water, all good," Marcus called into his waterproof radio as soon as he caught his breath. The relief in his voice was unmistakable, but it was quickly replaced by focus on his next responsibility, guiding David through his jump. From his position in the water, Marcus looked up at the helicopter hovering 30 feet above. He could see David's silhouette in the doorway, and even from this distance, he could sense the younger Marine's nervous energy. This was the moment where trust became everything. David had to believe that Marcus had successfully completed the jump, and that he could do the same. "Second jumper, you are clear for insertion," came Hayes' voice over the radio. "First jumper is safely in the water and standing by to assist." Marcus treaded water and positioned himself to provide guidance. "Rodriguez, you've got this," he called up, his voice carrying clearly in the ocean air. "Remember your training, trust your technique, and I'll be right here when you hit the water." He watched as David took his position in the doorway. Even from 30 feet away, Marcus could see the determination in the young Marine's posture. David had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, and now it was time to put that preparation to the test. "Staff Sergeant, I'm scared," David's voice came through the radio. Honest and vulnerable, in a way that took courage to admit. "That's normal, Marine," Marcus replied immediately. "Fear means you understand the significance of what you're doing. Use it to sharpen your focus. You've done this 100 times in training. The only difference now is that it's real." Marcus could see David nodding in the helicopter doorway. The young Marine took a visible deep breath, checked his position one final time, and then stepped out into the void. Watching someone else make the jump was almost more nerve-wracking than making it himself. Marcus found himself holding his breath as David fell toward the water, silently urging him to maintain proper form. The younger Marine's technique was textbook perfect. Body straight, arms crossed, controlled descent. When David hit the water, the impact was clean and professional. Marcus immediately swam toward the point of impact, reaching David just as he surfaced. The young Marine came up sputtering but grinning, his face showing a mixture of relief, exhilaration, and pure joy. "That was incredible," David shouted, his voice carrying across the water. "I can't believe we just did that." "2 jumpers safely in the water," Marcus reported to the helicopter, standing by for third insertion. Now it was James's turn. From their position in the water, Marcus and David looked up at their teammates silhouetted in the helicopter doorway. James had been the calmest of the three throughout the preparation, but Marcus knew that everyone processes stress differently. Some people get nervous and show it, while others internalize their concerns and deal with them quietly. "Wilson, how are you feeling up there?" Marcus called through the radio. "Ready to join you, Staff Sergeant," James responded. His voice steady and confident. "This is what we trained for." James's jump was a thing of beauty. His form was perfect, his entry clean, and his surfacing quick and controlled. Within moments, all 3 Marines were treading water together in the Pacific, having successfully completed what many would consider an impossible task. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. They had faced their fears, trusted their training, and supported each other through one of the most challenging exercises any of them had ever attempted. But more than that, they had proven to themselves and each other that they could perform under extreme pressure when lives were on the line. "Outstanding work, Marines," came Gunnery Sergeant Hayes' voice over the radio. "You've just completed one of the most demanding training exercises in the Marine Corps. Your technique was professional, your teamwork was exemplary, and your courage was inspiring to watch." As they treaded water waiting for the recovery boat, the 3 Marines looked at each other with a new understanding. They had shared something that few people ever experience: the absolute trust that comes from putting your life in someone else's hands and knowing they won't let you down.
"You know what the crazy thing is?" David said, still breathing hard from the adrenaline.
"I actually want to do it again," James laughed. "That's the Marine Corps for you. Always making us want to push harder and go further." Marcus nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride in his teammates and in the organization that had brought them together. "That's because we know now that we can handle anything they throw at us. We've got the skills, we've got the training, and most importantly, we've got each other." The recovery boat arrived within minutes, its crew efficiently pulling the 3 Marines aboard. As they wrapped themselves in towels and began the process of debriefing, Marcus reflected on what they had accomplished. The jump itself was impressive, but the real achievement was the trust they had built and the confidence they had gained in each other. "How do you feel?" asked the boat's coxswain, a veteran Marine who had conducted countless recovery operations. "Like we can take on the world," David replied without hesitation. The coxswain smiled. "That's the point, Marine. That's exactly the point." As the boat headed back towards shore, Marcus looked at his 2 companions and realized that something fundamental had changed between them. They weren't just fellow Marines anymore, or even close friends. They were brothers who had proven they would trust each other with their lives. That kind of bond, once forged, could never be broken. The first phase of their training was complete, but Marcus had a feeling that this was just the beginning. The Marine Corps had a way of building on success, of taking what you thought were your limits and showing you that you were capable of so much more. If this was what they could accomplish on their first day, he couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. The helicopter followed them back toward shore, its rotors beating a steady rhythm against the ocean air. Inside, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes was already planning the next phase of their training. What the 3 Marines didn't know was that today's jump was only the first step in a series of exercises designed to forge them into an elite rescue team. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove themselves, and new chances to demonstrate the unbreakable bonds of Marine brotherhood. The morning of their second training day dawned grey and overcast, with a sharp wind cutting across Camp Pendleton that promised challenging conditions ahead. Marcus arrived at the briefing room 30 minutes early, as was his habit, and found David and James already there, studying weather reports and reviewing the previous day's performance metrics. The successful completion of their first helicopter insertion had given all 3 Marines a new sense of confidence, but Marcus knew better than to let success breed complacency. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes entered the briefing room with an expression that immediately told Marcus this wouldn't be a routine training day. Her weathered face carried the look of someone who had seen every possible complication that could arise during military operations, and her body language suggested they were about to face some of those complications firsthand. "Good morning, Marines," she began, her voice carrying the weight of serious business. "Yesterday you proved you could execute a standard helicopter insertion under optimal conditions. Today we're going to find out what happens when optimal conditions don't exist." She activated the wall-mounted display showing a detailed weather map of the coastal training area. Red and yellow markers indicated wind speeds, wave heights, and visibility conditions that looked far more challenging than anything they had encountered before. Current conditions: wind speeds gusting to 25 knots, wave heights 3 to 4 feet. Visibility reduced to half a mile due to marine layer fog. Water temperature has dropped to 68 degrees, and the insertion zone has been moved to simulate a real-world rescue scenario where perfect conditions simply don't exist.
Marcus felt his stomach tighten.
25-knot winds meant the helicopter would be fighting to maintain stable positioning. Reduced visibility would make it harder for them to coordinate their jumps and for the recovery team to track their positions. Lower water temperature increased the risk of hypothermia if anything went wrong during the exercise. "Mom," David raised his hand, his voice steady despite the challenging conditions they were facing. "Are we still executing from 30 feet, or will the altitude be adjusted for the weather conditions?" Hayes nodded approvingly at the question. 30 feet remains the standard insertion altitude. In a real rescue scenario, you don't get to choose your conditions. You adapt to whatever the situation presents and you complete the mission. She continued the briefing, explaining that today's exercise would simulate a scenario where they were responding to a distressed civilian vessel that had suffered mechanical failure in rough seas. Time would be critical, coordination would be essential, and margin for error would be minimal. "Additionally," Hayes said, her expression growing even more serious, "today you'll be jumping with full rescue gear. Each of you will carry medical supplies, emergency flotation devices, and communication equipment. The extra weight will affect your fall characteristics and water entry. You'll need to adjust your technique accordingly." The gear they would carry added approximately 15 pounds to each Marine's load. While that might not sound like much, Marcus knew from experience that every extra pound made a difference when falling from height and entering water. The additional equipment would also affect their buoyancy and movement in the water. As they suited up for the mission, Marcus noticed that the usual pre-exercise banter between the three Marines was replaced by focused concentration. They checked each other's gear with extra attention to detail, reviewed hand signals multiple times, and went through contingency procedures for various emergency scenarios. "You know," James said as he adjusted his equipment harness, "my grandfather used to tell me that the real test of a Marine isn't how well you perform when everything goes right, it's how you react when everything starts going wrong." David nodded, securing his medical kit to his vest. "My brother always said that training under perfect conditions only teaches you to handle perfect conditions. The real learning happens when nothing goes according to plan." Marcus appreciated his teammates' perspective, but he also felt the weight of responsibility as the senior Marine in their group. If something went wrong today, these younger Marines would look to him for leadership and guidance. That responsibility was something he took seriously, and it drove him to be even more thorough in his preparation. The helicopter ride to the insertion point was markedly different from the previous day. The aircraft bucked and swayed in the gusty winds, and through the windows, they could see the ocean surface churned into whitecaps by the weather. The fog was so thick that visibility dropped to near zero at times, forcing the pilot to rely on instruments and GPS coordinates to navigate to the target area. "This is going to be interesting," the crew chief shouted over the noise of the rotors and wind. Weather Service is calling it marginal conditions for flight operations, but still within acceptable parameters for the exercise. As they approached the insertion zone, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "We're experiencing significant turbulence and wind shear. I'll do my best to maintain stable hover, but you may need to adjust your timing based on aircraft movement." Marcus looked out the helicopter door and felt his confidence waver for the first time. The ocean below was no longer the calm, sparkling surface they had encountered yesterday. Today it was a grey, churning mass of water that seemed to reach up toward them with foam-capped waves. The fog made it difficult to judge distances, and the helicopter's movement made it challenging to maintain visual reference points. "First insertion in 60 seconds, Hayes announced. "Remember, Marines, conditions are challenging but not impossible. Trust your training, communicate clearly, and watch out for each other." Marcus moved to the door and took his position. The extra weight of his gear was immediately noticeable, affecting his balance and making it harder to maintain stable positioning in the swaying aircraft. Below him, the ocean looked angry and uninviting. Nothing like the welcoming blue waters of the previous day. "Wind gust coming from the southwest," the pilot announced. "Recommend delay of insertion until conditions stabilize." For 30 seconds, they waited while the helicopter fought to maintain position. Marcus could feel the aircraft being pushed around by the wind, and he had to brace himself against the doorframe to keep from being thrown off balance. Finally, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "We have a brief window of stability. Execute insertion now." Marcus didn't hesitate. Despite the challenging conditions, his training took over, and he stepped out into the wind and fog. Immediately, he knew something was different. The extra weight of his gear, combined with the gusting wind, threw off his carefully practiced technique. Instead of the controlled, vertical descent he had executed yesterday, He found himself spinning slightly as he fell. The wind caught him and pushed him sideways, away from his intended landing point. He fought to regain control of his position, but the extra equipment made it difficult to adjust his body orientation. When he hit the water, it was at a slight angle instead of the perfect vertical entry he had planned. The impact drove him deeper than expected, and the cold water was a shock to his system, even through his wetsuit. The waves were much larger than they appeared from the helicopter, and as he surfaced, he found himself immediately fighting to stay afloat, in conditions that were far more challenging than anything he had trained for. "First jumper in the water," he reported, but his voice carried strain as he fought to maintain position in the choppy seas. "Conditions are rougher than anticipated. Recommend closer spacing for subsequent insertions." Above him, he could see the helicopter struggling to maintain position. The fog had thickened, making it difficult to see David preparing for his jump. Marcus realized that the carefully coordinated insertion they had planned was already falling apart, and they would need to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. "Second jumper, execute insertion," came Hayes's voice, but Marcus could hear tension in her tone that hadn't been there yesterday. David's jump was immediately problematic. The wind caught him even more severely than it had Marcus, spinning him around and pushing him well away from the intended landing zone. Marcus watched in growing concern as his teammates struggled to maintain proper position during his fall. When David hit the water, it was clear that something had gone wrong. Instead of the clean entry they had practiced, he landed awkwardly, and Marcus could see him struggling to surface properly. Without hesitation, Marcus began swimming toward his teammate's position, fighting against waves that seemed determined to push them apart. "Rodriguez, sound off," Marcus called through his radio as he battled through the churning water. "I'm okay, but I think I twisted something when I hit." David's voice came back, tight with pain and effort. "The waves are a lot bigger than they looked from up there." Marcus reached David just as another large wave crashed over both of them. The younger Marine was clearly struggling, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort and concern. Marcus could see that David's left shoulder was bothering him, probably strained during his awkward water entry. "Wilson, hold your insertion," Marcus called up to the helicopter. "We need to assess second jumper's condition before proceeding." But as he looked up, Marcus realized that the fog had become so thick that he could barely see the aircraft. The helicopter seemed to be drifting away from their position, probably fighting to maintain visual contact with the Marines in the water while dealing with the increasingly challenging weather conditions. James's voice came over the radio, calm but with an underlying tension. "I can barely see you two down there. The fog is getting worse and the pilot is having trouble maintaining position." This was exactly the kind of scenario that Marcus had trained for but hoped never to encounter. They had 2 Marines in rough water, one potentially injured, with deteriorating weather conditions, and a helicopter that was struggling to maintain visual contact. Everything that could go wrong was starting to go wrong, and it was happening fast. "Hayes, we need to modify the exercise," Marcus called through his radio. "Conditions have deteriorated beyond safe parameters for continuing the planned insertion sequence." There was a pause before Hayes responded, and Marcus could hear the helicopter's engines changing pitch as the pilot fought to maintain control in the gusting wind. "Negative, Staff Sergeant," came her reply. "This is exactly the kind of situation you need to be prepared for. Real rescues don't happen in perfect conditions. You need to adapt and overcome." Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but he also understood Hayes's point. In a real emergency, they wouldn't have the luxury of calling off the mission because conditions weren't ideal. People's lives would depend on their ability to function effectively, regardless of circumstances. Another large wave crashed over them, and Marcus realized that David was starting to tire from fighting the rough water. The younger Marine's breathing was becoming labored, and his movements were less coordinated than they should be. The combination of cold water, challenging conditions, and a possible injury was taking its toll. "Wilson, we need you in the water now," Marcus called up to the helicopter. "Rodriguez needs assistance, and I can't provide effective support while maintaining our current positions." "Copy that, Staff Sergeant," James replied immediately. Executing insertion. Marcus watched as James positioned himself in the helicopter doorway. Even through the fog, and at this distance, he could see his teammates' determination. James had always been the steadiest of the 3, and Marcus knew he could count on him to execute properly, even under these difficult conditions. James's jump was as professional as always, but even his excellent technique couldn't completely compensate for the challenging conditions. The wind pushed him off course, and his landing point was further from Marcus and David than was ideal. Still, He executed a clean water entry and surfaced quickly. Now, all 3 Marines were in rough water, fighting waves and wind, with one potentially injured and visibility continuing to deteriorate. The helicopter hovered somewhere above them, but the fog was so thick that maintaining visual contact was becoming nearly impossible. All 3 jumpers in the water, Marcus reported, beginning emergency coordination procedures. What happened next would test everything they had learned about teamwork, leadership, and the Marine Corps values that had brought them together. They were about to discover that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against enemy forces but against the unforgiving forces of nature and the limitations of human endurance. The Pacific Ocean had transformed from a training environment into something that felt genuinely hostile. Marcus treaded water between his 2 teammates, trying to maintain visual contact with both David and James while waves crashed over them with increasing frequency. The fog had thickened to the point where the helicopter was nothing more than a distant sound somewhere above them, its rotors barely audible over the wind and crashing water. David was clearly struggling. His face had gone pale, and Marcus could see that every movement of his left arm caused him visible pain. The shoulder injury from his awkward landing was worse than they had initially thought, and the cold water was starting to affect his coordination. In training scenarios, they had always assumed that if something went wrong, help would be immediately available. Now Marcus was facing the reality that sometimes help isn't coming, and you have to solve problems with whatever resources you have at hand. "Rodriguez, talk to me," Marcus called out, swimming closer to the younger Marine. "How's that shoulder feeling?" "It's not good, Staff Sergeant," David replied, his voice tight with pain and effort. "I can barely move my left arm, and it's getting harder to stay afloat." James had reached them by now, and Marcus could see the concern in his teammates' eyes as he assessed David's condition. The steady Marine from Montana had always been the problem solver of their group, and Marcus could practically see him running through possible solutions in his head. "We need to get him stabilized," James said, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "If that shoulder is dislocated or seriously strained, he's going to tire out fast in these conditions." Marcus nodded, his mind racing through their options. They had emergency flotation devices in their gear, but deploying them in these rough conditions would be challenging. The helicopter was still somewhere above them, but radio communication was becoming increasingly difficult due to the weather interference and the distance that was growing between them. "Hayes, do you copy?" Marcus called into his radio, having to shout to be heard over the wind and waves. Static answered him for several seconds before Hayes' voice came through, broken and distorted. "Copy, barely. Visibility, 0, pilot. Maintain position." The transmission cut out completely, leaving the 3 Marines effectively on their own in the middle of the Pacific. Marcus felt a moment of genuine fear, not for himself but for his teammates. David was injured and tiring rapidly. They were all fighting increasingly rough conditions, and their support was unable to provide immediate assistance. "Okay," Marcus said, forcing his voice to remain calm and authoritative despite the circumstances. "We're going to handle this ourselves. Wilson, help me get Rodriguez into a stable position. We'll deploy his emergency flotation and create a recovery triangle." The recovery triangle was an emergency formation they had practiced but never executed under actual distress conditions. It involved 2 healthy Marines supporting an injured teammate while maintaining a triangular formation that was easier for recovery teams to spot from above. The key was keeping everyone together while conserving energy and preventing further injury. James immediately moved to David's right side while Marcus took his left, being careful not to aggravate the shoulder injury. Working together, they helped David remove his emergency flotation device from his gear and get it properly deployed. The small inflatable vest would help keep him afloat without requiring him to use his injured arm. "That's better," David said, his voice carrying relief as the flotation device took some of the strain off his injured shoulder. "Thanks, guys. I was starting to think I might not be able to keep this up much longer." "You don't have to keep anything up," Marcus replied firmly. "We're a team, and teams take care of each other. That's what we do." As they worked to establish the recovery triangle formation, Marcus was struck by how different this felt from their training exercises. In controlled conditions, everything had been predictable and manageable. Here, every wave seemed to try to push them apart. Every gust of wind made communication more difficult, and the constant motion made even simple tasks challenging. "Staff Sergeant," James said, his voice carrying a note of concern that was unusual for him. "I'm starting to lose feeling in my fingers. This water is colder than I expected, and we've been in here longer than planned." Marcus realized that James was right. They had been in the water for nearly 20 minutes, and the combination of cold temperature and physical exertion was starting to affect all of them. Hypothermia was becoming a real concern, especially for David, who was already weakened by his injury.
We need to increase our activity level to maintain body heat, Marcus decided.
We'll take turns doing active warming exercises while maintaining formation. Rodriguez, you focus on staying relaxed and letting us handle the movement. They began a rotation where each Marine would spend 2 minutes doing active swimming movements to generate body heat while the other two maintained the formation. It was exhausting work, but it helped keep their core temperatures stable and gave everyone something constructive to focus on. During one of his active warming periods, James suddenly stopped swimming and pointed toward a break in the fog. "I think I see the helicopter." Marcus looked in the direction James was pointing and caught a glimpse of the aircraft through the shifting wall of mist. The pilot was clearly working to get closer to their position, but the fog was making navigation extremely difficult. "Hayes, this is Chen." Marcus called into his radio with renewed hope. "We have visual on the aircraft. Can you see us?" "Negative on visual contact," came the distorted reply. "Continue. Emergency procedures. Recovery boat. Minutes." The transmission was too broken to understand completely, but Marcus caught the key words: recovery boat and minutes. Help was coming, but they needed to hold their position and stay together until it arrived. "Did you hear that?" David asked, his spirits noticeably lifted by the news. "Recovery boat is on the way." "That's right," Marcus replied, though privately he was concerned about how long minutes might actually be in these conditions. "We just need to maintain our position and stay together until they reach us." The next 20 minutes felt like hours. The waves seemed to get larger, the wind stronger, and the fog thicker. Marcus found himself constantly checking on his teammates, making sure David's flotation device was functioning properly and that James wasn't showing signs of hypothermia. The responsibility of leadership in a genuine emergency situation was unlike anything he had experienced in training. David, despite his injury and obvious discomfort, never complained and never asked for additional help beyond what his teammates were already providing. His determination to not become a burden on the team was inspiring, even as it was clear that he was fighting through significant pain and exhaustion. James continued to be the steady presence that held their small group together, constantly monitoring everyone's condition and making small adjustments to their formation as conditions changed. His calm demeanor provided an anchor of stability that kept panic from setting in during the most challenging moments. "You know what's interesting?" David said during a brief lull in the wind, his voice reflective despite their circumstances. "Yesterday we were worried about trusting each other enough to jump out of a helicopter. Today we're trusting each other with our lives in a way that really matters." Marcus realized that David was absolutely right. Yesterday's exercise had been about building trust in controlled conditions. Today was about discovering what that trust really meant when everything was on the line. They weren't just following orders or completing a training exercise anymore. They were genuinely depending on each other for survival. "That's what brotherhood means," James added, his voice carrying the wisdom that came from his family's generations of military service. "It's not about the easy times when everything goes according to plan. It's about moments like this, when you know beyond any doubt that the person next to you will do whatever it takes to make sure you all make it home." The sound of a boat engine cutting through the wind and waves was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever heard. Through the fog, he could see the outline of the recovery vessel approaching their position, its crew scanning the water with searchlights to locate the 3 Marines. "Recovery boat, this is Staff Sergeant Chen," Marcus called into his radio. 3 Marines in the water, 1 with shoulder injury, all conscious and responsive. "Copy that, Staff Sergeant," came the crisp reply. "We have visual on your position. Preparing for recovery operations." The boat's crew worked with professional efficiency to pull the 3 Marines aboard. David was lifted out first, his injured shoulder carefully supported throughout the process. James and Marcus followed, both exhausted but relieved to be out of the water. As they wrapped themselves in warm blankets and began the process of warming up, Marcus looked at his teammates with a new understanding of what they had accomplished. They had faced a genuine emergency situation, worked together under extreme pressure, and taken care of each other when it really mattered. The bonds forged in yesterday's successful training had been tested today under conditions that no one could have predicted, and those bonds had held. "How do you feel?" asked the boat's medic as he checked David's shoulder. "Like we just learned what being Marines really means," David replied without hesitation. The medic smiled. "From what I saw out there, you 3 already knew that. You just proved it to yourselves." As the boat headed back toward shore, Marcus reflected on the events of the day. They had started with a training exercise that was supposed to build on yesterday's success, Instead, they had faced a real emergency that tested everything they thought they knew about teamwork, leadership, and brotherhood. The helicopter appeared through the fog, following them back to base. Over the radio, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes' voice came through clearly for the first time in over an hour. "Outstanding work today, Marines. You faced adversity, adapted to changing conditions, and took care of each other. That's what the Marine Corps is all about." Marcus knew that today had changed all three of them. They had discovered that trust wasn't just about following orders or completing missions. It was about being willing to risk everything for the people standing beside you. That was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. 6 months after their harrowing experience in the Pacific, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen sat in a military transport aircraft somewhere over the Mediterranean Sea, watching the coastline of a country he couldn't name slide by 30,000 feet below. The classified mission they were about to undertake would test everything they had learned during those 2 unforgettable days of training at Camp Pendleton, but this time, civilian lives hung in the balance. Beside him, now Corporal David Rodriguez checked his equipment for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, his left shoulder moving with only the slightest hesitation that betrayed his old injury. The shoulder had healed completely, but the experience of being helpless in rough water had driven David to train harder than ever before. He had become the most technically proficient Marine in their unit, determined never again to be the weak link in any operation. Across the aircraft, Lance Corporal James Wilson studied satellite imagery of their target area, with the same calm focus that had kept them together in the Pacific. The crisis they had shared had revealed depths to his character that even his closest friends hadn't fully appreciated. James had been promoted ahead of schedule and was now being groomed for leadership positions that would eventually take him far beyond the 3-man team that had become his family. Their destination was a cargo ship that had been hijacked by armed pirates 2 days earlier while carrying humanitarian supplies to refugees. The ship's crew of 12 civilians was being held hostage, and diplomatic efforts to secure their release had failed. Intelligence indicated that the pirates were planning to execute the hostages within hours unless their demands for ransom were met. The rescue mission would require a helicopter insertion onto the moving ship in darkness, followed by a coordinated assault to neutralize the pirates and secure the hostages. It was exactly the kind of high-risk operation that their unconventional training had prepared them for, though none of them had imagined at the time that they would be using those skills to save innocent lives. "Final approach in 15 minutes, announced the aircraft's loadmaster.
Weather conditions at the target are favorable, but expect crosswinds and deck movement due to sea state."
Marcus looked at his teammates and saw his own mixture of anticipation and determination reflected in their faces.
The months since their training accident had brought them countless hours of additional preparation, advanced tactical training, and specialized mission rehearsals. But more importantly, it had deepened the trust and understanding between them in ways that only shared adversity can create. "Remember," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority that came with experience, "we go in fast, we work together, and we bring everyone home. Hostiles and hostages. No one gets left behind." David nodded, his hand unconsciously checking the position of his medical kit. Since his injury in the Pacific, he had become obsessed with emergency medical training, driven by a determination to be able to help his teammates if they were ever in a similar situation. His expertise had already saved lives during training exercises, and tonight, it might be crucial for the hostages they were trying to rescue. "Just like we practiced," James added, his calm voice providing the steady anchor it always did before operations. "Clean insertion, coordinated movement, controlled violence of action. We know this ship, we know the layout, and we know each other." The helicopter that would carry them to the target was a newer model than the one they had trained in at Camp Pendleton, but the principles remained the same. Trust your equipment, trust your training, and above all, trust the Marines standing beside you. The insertion would be more challenging than their training jumps, requiring them to fast rope onto a moving ship in darkness. But the skills were transferable. 2 minutes out came the pilot's voice over the intercom. "Target acquired, beginning final approach." Through the aircraft windows, Marcus could see the cargo ship below, its lights creating a small island of illumination on the dark ocean. Intelligence reports indicated that most of the pirates were concentrated on the bridge and in the crew quarters, leaving the main deck relatively clear for their insertion. The plan called for a simultaneous 3-point insertion that would allow them to secure the deck and begin moving toward the hostages within minutes. "You know what I keep thinking about?" David said as they prepared their gear for the final time. "That day in the water when everything went wrong. If we could handle that situation with one of us injured and no immediate support, we can handle anything." Marcus understood what David meant. That emergency in the Pacific had stripped away all pretense and shown them who they really were when everything was on the line. They had discovered that they were Marines, who would never abandon each other, no matter how difficult the circumstances became. Tonight, they would extend that same commitment to 12 innocent people they had never met. 1 minute to insertion, the pilot announced. Deck is clear. No visible opposition. Winds are within acceptable parameters. The 3 Marines moved to the helicopter door as it slid open, revealing the cargo ship's deck 40 feet below. The ship was larger than it had appeared in the satellite photos, and Marcus could see the complexity of the task ahead of them. Multiple levels, numerous hiding places for both hostiles and hostages, and the constant movement of the deck beneath their feet once they landed. "Remember the triangle formation," Marcus said as they prepared to fast rope down. "Secure the landing zone, establish communications, then move according to the plan. If something goes wrong, we adapt and overcome. Just like always." James took his position at the rope first, his steady hands gripping the thick line with practiced confidence. "See you on deck," he said simply, then disappeared into the darkness below. David followed immediately, his technical precision evident even in the brief glimpse Marcus caught of his descent. Despite the injury he had suffered months earlier, David had become the most technically proficient of the 3, his determination to never be a liability, driving him to excellence in every aspect of their training. Marcus was the last to descend, and as he slid down the rope toward the ship's deck, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes operations, but underneath the excitement was something deeper. An absolute confidence in the Marines who had reached the deck before him and who would be waiting to support him when he landed. The insertion went flawlessly. Within 30 seconds, all 3 Marines were on deck, had established a secure perimeter, and were beginning their movement toward the crew quarters where intelligence indicated the hostages were being held. The months of training since their experience in the Pacific had honed their teamwork to a level that approached telepathy. As they moved through the ship's corridors, Marcus was struck by how naturally they functioned as a unit. David took point with his precise movements and technical expertise. James provided steady support and tactical awareness, and Marcus coordinated their actions while maintaining communication with their command element. It was the same dynamic that had kept them together in the rough waters of the Pacific, adapted now to a completely different but equally challenging environment. The first contact with pirates came sooner than expected. As they rounded a corner near the crew quarters, they encountered 2 armed men who were clearly surprised by the sudden appearance of Marines aboard their captured ship. The engagement was brief and decisive, with James and David working together to neutralize the threat while Marcus secured the area and continued their advance toward the hostages. 2 down, continuing to objective, Marcus reported through his radio, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. They found the hostages exactly where intelligence had indicated, locked in a small compartment near the engine room, guarded by 3 more pirates who surrendered immediately when faced with overwhelming force. The 12 crew members were frightened and exhausted but unharmed, their relief at being rescued evident in their faces and voices. "We're United States Marines," Marcus told them as his teammates secured the area. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." The extraction of the hostages required the same kind of coordination and trust that had characterized every aspect of their partnership. David used his medical training to assess the crew members for injuries and shock. James secured their route back to the extraction point, and Marcus coordinated with the helicopter crew to ensure a smooth evacuation. As they moved the hostages toward the main deck, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months earlier, they had been 3 Marines learning to trust each other during routine training exercises. Tonight, they were a precision rescue team saving innocent lives in one of the world's most dangerous environments. "Extraction point secure," James reported as they reached the deck. "All hostiles neutralized, all hostages accounted for." The helicopter extraction went as smoothly as the insertion had. One by one, the rescued crew members were lifted to safety, followed by the 3 Marines who had risked everything to save them. As the aircraft lifted off from the cargo ship and headed toward the safety of international waters, Marcus looked at his teammates and saw the same sense of accomplishment and purpose that had bonded them together in the Pacific. "Mission complete," he reported to their command element. "All hostages rescued, no friendly casualties." But even as he made the official report, Marcus knew that the real accomplishment wasn't the successful completion of their mission. It was the demonstration that the trust and brotherhood forged in training could be relied upon when lives truly hung in the balance. They had proven to themselves and to everyone who mattered that Marines who trust each other completely are capable of achieving the impossible. "You know what the best part is?" David said as they settled back for the flight home. 6 months ago, We were learning to jump out of helicopters. Tonight, we used those skills to save 12 people's lives. James nodded, his characteristic calm expressing satisfaction that went deeper than words could convey. That's what it's all about. All the training, all the preparation, all the trust we've built. It all comes down to being able to help people when they need it most. Marcus looked out the helicopter window at the dark ocean below and thought about the path that had brought them here. From that first terrifying but exhilarating jump into calm waters, through the emergency that had tested their bonds under pressure, to tonight's successful rescue mission, they had grown from individual Marines into something much more powerful. A team that could be trusted with the most important missions their country could assign. Years later, when each of them had moved on to new assignments and new challenges, they would stay in touch through letters, emails, and occasional visits. David would become a military doctor, using his medical expertise to save lives around the world. James would rise through the ranks to become a commanding officer, leading other Marines with the same steady leadership he had always provided. Marcus would transition to training roles, passing on to new generations of Marines the lessons about trust and brotherhood that had defined his own career. But no matter where their individual paths led them, they would always carry with them the knowledge of what they had accomplished together. They had learned that trust isn't just about following orders or completing missions. It's about being willing to put your life in someone else's hands and knowing they will never let you down. They had discovered that brotherhood isn't just a word or a concept. It's a living commitment that grows stronger when tested by adversity. And most importantly, they had proven that when Marines trust each other completely, there is no mission too difficult, no challenge too great, and no enemy too powerful to prevent them from bringing everyone home safely. That knowledge would stay with them for the rest of their lives, a source of strength and confidence that would serve them well in whatever challenges the future might bring. The helicopter continued its flight through the night, carrying 3 Marines who had learned that the most important lessons in life aren't taught in classrooms or found in manuals. They're discovered in moments of crisis when you have to choose between your own safety and your commitment to the people standing beside you. And when you make that choice correctly, when you choose brotherhood over self-preservation, you become part of something larger than yourself, something that can never be broken or destroyed.